Okay, I'm recording it now. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like there for the moment. All right. We're going to start with two women from the San Francisco Bay Area, Eleanor Cox and Stacy Farr, and they're visible on your screen now. Those of you who've joined us previously will recognize Eleanor, as she has been one of our moderators. She works in historic preservation planning and cultural resources, specializing in cultural landscapes. Eleanor honed her experience working for the National Park Service and the Cultural Landscape Foundation in Washington, D.C. Her colleague, Stacy Farr, is an architectural historian and cultural resources planner. She has completed research in a wide variety of subjects. Eleanor and Stacy will tell us about a nursery site in San Francisco and the surprisingly rich and complex cultural history of the place. Nancy Carroll Carter also serves on the board for CGLHS, researches and writes in the area of horticultural and landscape history, and she'll give the second part of our talk. Her past work has appeared in several journals, including Eden, where you'll find the second part of her two-part history on the Italian style in California gardens. And it's an excellent treatise. She is keenly interested in Balboa Park, and she'll take us to visit a curious corner of that park. This lecture is being recorded. It'll last about an hour. It'll be available on YouTube at a later date, and it'll be available to members only via our website. We'll have a question and answer period at the end, and type your questions into the chat box at any time. So let's talk about how you access that chat box if you're not familiar with it. You may see a chat box icon on the bottom or the top of your Zoom screen. Click on it and a chat box will open to the side. On some devices, you'll need to use your mouse to hover over the screen at the top or the bottom, and then that icon will pop up. Your chat box may appear as a separate window, and that can be kind of distracting. If that happens and you want to see the chat box on the side of your screen, use your View Options command. It's where your other commands are located. Finally, we ask everyone to turn off your videos. The camera view of you watching the talk is distracting to others. That command is located with your other commands or next to your own image. We'll turn it off if we can, but we have limitations on our account that can make that difficult. So with that, let's get started. Okay. Are you ready to share, Eleanor?
Yes.
You should be able to do so.
Let me know when you see it.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Janet,
But
for that.
It's actually showing you your notes slide. It's your
Let me fix that.
screen, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. Is that better?
It'll work. It's still showing your notes in your next slide, your upcoming slide, but we can certainly see the main slide. I'm not sure why the entire view isn't coming up.
Okay. Let me try one more time.
Better.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, we'll still see your slide preview, but
Now can you see the full screen?
Perfect, you did it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Janet. My name is Eleanor. I'm a CGLH member and I joined the organization about 5 years ago. I work as a historian in San Francisco, but I'm really interested in the history of landscapes and cultural landscapes. What we see here is our subject site for the first half of tonight's lecture. It's the University Mound greenhouses located in the Portola neighborhood of San Francisco, which is in the southeast quadrant, really underserved in terms of open space, green space, and historic preservation. So I became aware of this site around the same time I joined the org, maybe 5 years ago. You can see that it's in really neglected condition right now. And I was curious why. I was curious about the history. I was curious about the future of the site. It just piqued my interest. A few years ago, my colleague Stacy was approached about potentially landmarking the site. And when Janet circulated the invitation to complete a HALS documentation for lost and vanishing landscapes, I thought this would be perfect. And so Stacy and I combined efforts and submitted a document to the National Park Service that documents the current conditions of this site. It was operated by the same family for multiple generations, and it grew primarily roses. And when Stacy comes on, she'll give you a really detailed description as they grew and why it's historically significant. But before we get there, I thought I would set up provide you with a context for what makes greenhouses significant, what makes flower growing historically significant. So man-made and curated indoor growing environments are not new. We have evidence that they existed in ancient civilizations, and they've been known by many names over time, including hothouses, orangeries, and winter gardens. But our modern and Western interpretation of the building type can pretty easily trace its origins to Victorian England and usually takes the form of ornate display houses, often known as conservatories. The prototype is usually the Crystal Palace, illustrated here. It was designed by Joseph Paxton at the behest of Queen Victoria for the Great Exhibition in 1851. The ridge and furrow roof form is a common type of roof for greenhouses. It's generally attributed to J.C. Loudon, who was a 19th century Scottish botanist and who helped introduce the term landscape architecture. Loudon devised the ridge and furrow to optimize sun exposure, and the concept was utilized by Paxton at the Crystal Palace, but it's most commonly employed in the design and the siting of commercial greenhouses, which are focused on production as opposed to the display of beautiful plants. The Great Exhibition spurred a movement in large-scale glasshouse construction in public gardens across Europe, from Copenhagen to Florence. The fashion did not move quite as fast in America. Our public park movement was slightly slower to take off as our government continued their policy of westward expansion during the mid to late 19th century, with a focus on capturing wilderness rather than curating it. There are familiar examples located in our public parks, including this one here, which is the Conservatory of Flowers in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. It was built in 1878, and this photo was taken in 1880, just a couple of years after it was completed. The form with the tall central dome and the wings extending from either side is modeled after the Palm House at Kew Gardens in London. Interestingly, the Conservatory of Flowers was built with redwood frame rather than iron, which was used for contemporaneous projects in Europe and east of the Mississippi River. But these types of glasshouses are display houses, which means that they're designed to highlight the visitor experience and showcase specimen plants, often from all over the world. However, the same technology that was used to perfect the design of display houses was used to create greenhouses that focus on cultivation and production, known as commercial greenhouses. And this type of greenhouse was far less ornate in its design, and it served agricultural purposes. To be more specific, commercial greenhouses in the United States historically supported floriculture operations, or the growing of cut flowers for wholesale. The commercial range shown here is a rose growing range in upstate New York, and this picture was taken around the turn of the last century. American consumer markets in the early part of the 19th century were located on the East Coast, where they had limited growing seasons. Flower flower farmers worked out of doors growing field flowers, but could only produce for part of the year. So as the flower trade grew, farmers began looking for methods to expand their growing season. Conservatory technology was adapted to meet the flower production needs and fairly quickly reached industry-wide
I'm listening to it,
standardization of
so
forms
you're
and
California.
materials based on the desired
California
product.
Historic Landscapes, something.
Fire up your computer and see.
Ideal growing conditions for different species of flowers were manipulated through the form and the infrastructure of the greenhouse. Factors such as siting, orientation, ventilation, heating, and shading, and the interior arrangement of the house, like benches or paths, all influence the health and the productivity of the plants. Standardized rose houses are identified via their uneven roof form, which you can see here. This is a long span left of the roof ridge, and this is a short span to the right of the roof ridge. Even span gable houses are often oriented in a north-south position so that the light is distributed throughout the day. But uneven span roof houses like these are often oriented east to west, with the long span facing south in order to capture as much direct light as possible. Roses were thought to benefit from a higher level of heat than other flowers and could sustain the direct light. And here you can see the sort of ridge and furrow roof form imitated in how the greenhouses are sited. This is the typical interior of a rose growing greenhouse. While most greenhouses were located, while the growing season in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest was longer than that of New York, greenhouses were still useful in terms of manipulating the interior growing environment. So as improvements in refrigerated transportation like trucks and air travel increased, California quickly became the center of the floriculture trade in America during the 20th century. This is a great photo because it really, I think, illustrates the industrial nature of the floriculture industry. You can see the density of the plants here and the very narrow mechanisms that were created to move through the house in order to care for and harvest the plants. And it just gives you a sense of how much was grown in these very small spaces. The other interesting thing is that the benches appear to be stepped in order to mimic the roof form. Which brings us to our subject site, the University Mound greenhouses. This is a photo of the site back when it had all of its glazing, taken around, we think in the 1920s, before the full range was built out. It takes up one square block, one square city block here, and you can again see the kind of imitation ridge and furrow roof form that's created through the repetitive pattern and the siding of the houses. This is the site today, or a few years ago. This picture was taken by Stacy. Again, you can see the uneven roof form really well here. The door is at the center of the house and it's just to the left of the roof ridge. And finally, this picture was taken just this year, and what you see are some of the roses that have survived since it was abandoned in the 1990s, and they're still growing and they're still peeking up through the collapsed roof of one of the greenhouses. This was clearly a yellow rose house. And from my final slide, I'll share this photo taken from inside one of the standing houses where you can see some red roses popping up through what was either a path or a bench at one point. And I think I'll turn it over to Stacy now, and she'll be able to talk about some of the really interesting preservation solutions that are being explored for this site, because there is community interest in both the history and the future of this site. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Eleanor. How about that? Do you see the full screen or you see the previous next slide?
I think we're seeing the same notes thing.
Yeah, we are.
How does that happen? How about now?
You did it. You've got it now.
Okay, but I'm at the middle of my slideshow. Let's try again. Okay, we're good? Okay. Thank you. As Janet and Eleanor introduced me, my name is Stacy Farr. I'm an architectural historian and a cultural resource advocate. I used to work independently, but I recently joined the preservation architecture firm of ARG in San Francisco. I was contacted in the fall of 2017 by an advocacy organization called the Greenhouse Project. They told me they were interested in preparing a local landmark nomination for some commercial flower growing greenhouses out in the Portola neighborhood of San Francisco. So I've lived in the Bay Area for 25 years. I have to honestly admit, I had never heard of the Portola neighborhood of San Francisco. So in my line of work, the opportunity to learn about a whole new neighborhood and a whole new industry, that's really something very special. So I said yes. They hired me, and we have been working together for the past 3 years to document the history of this site and to try to find a preservation solution for this really unique resource. So on the San Francisco Peninsula, the Portola neighborhood is located in the southeast quadrant of the city. If we zoom in a little bit closer, it's bound by 280 at the north, Highway 101 at the east. McLaren Park is down in the southwest part of the neighborhood. And there's two really big city-owned municipal water reservoirs right in the middle of the neighborhood. So the greenhouses are actually located right to the southeast of the reservoirs. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see it occupies a whole city block. It doesn't really look like anything else around it. But if we compare this to a 1938 photograph, you can see that it actually looks very much like it did 82 years ago. And then if we zoom back out to the whole Portola neighborhood, you can see that this neighborhood actually used to be covered with similar greenhouses. And all these greenhouses were used for growing flowers. So a little bit about the neighborhood's natural history in order to explain why so many greenhouses were built out here. The whole Portola sits on a very gentle south sloping hill, which gives it really great sun exposure, and it also protects it from some of the fog and the more harsh wind conditions that San Francisco can be kind of known for. The neighborhood has a very high water table. It's located on the pathway of the Yosemite Slough, which Yosemite Creek actually starts up in McLaren Park. It travels through the Portola and it empties out into the bay. Now that's been channelized for a long time, but it's right below the surface and it gives the whole neighborhood a good water table, and it helps, it really makes growing things a lot easier. If we zoom back out geographically, in the 1880s when greenhouses started to be built out here, this area was far enough from downtown that land was still available, but it was close enough to downtown that it was easy to get the crop to market, especially up the east side of the peninsula. It was pretty well developed with transportation routes by that time. And then after the turn of the century, San Francisco relocated all of its cemeteries down to Colma, right south of the city. So the Portola neighborhood was actually also able to serve that new market south of the city. They kind of were in a very ideal location to keep providing flowers for the city. And then one more note about this neighborhood's pre-greenhouse history. Even in the Mexican rancho era, cattle were routinely grazed down the San Francisco Peninsula, the San Bruno Mountains and beyond. And then, between 1850 and 1900, they were moved up the peninsula and slaughtered in this part of the city called Butchertown, which is right to the northeast of Portola. Now it's in the Bayview neighborhood, but it's up there in the bigger rectangle. All the city's slaughterhouses were concentrated up here, so often cattle would be driven up into the Portola neighborhood and held there in pens, waiting for their final destination. And so they were driven up Silver Avenue and then up Railroad Avenue to get to the slaughterhouses. So this kept the neighborhood sort of open because it was used for cattle penning, and then also well fertilized because of the cattle presence. So the first commercial flower growing business in the Portola neighborhood was established in 1865, and it was the only one out here until the 1880s. But then during the 1880s, about half a dozen nurseries were established out in the Portola neighborhood. At the beginning of the decade, it was German immigrants who were starting these businesses, but by the end of the 1880s, you really started to see the arrival of the three main ethnic groups that came to dominate the nursery industry in Portola, and that is the French, Belgian, and the largest group, the Italians. So Columbus Ferrari was the first Italian to grow flowers in this neighborhood. He came to the United States from Liguria, which is the coastal region of northern Italy around Genoa, that's really known for its robust flower industry. So Ferrari arrived with knowledge about how to grow flowers, but he followed a really traditional Italian immigrant path, which is he spent several years living in the ethnic enclave of North Beach, saving money. And then he used that money to purchase land in the outskirts of the city and start an agricultural business. And he moved to the Portola and started growing roses. And roses became the most common flower grown by Italian immigrants in San Francisco. This is an overview of the Ferrari nursery after the turn of the century. The family business expanded and covered over 4 city blocks. They grew roses, they also grew orchids, and they grew gardenias. And they became one of the largest flower growing establishments on the West Coast, and they operated up into the 1970s. And I did some oral histories with people who remember playing in these greenhouses when they were children. I like this map because you can really see, as Eleanor said, it was kind of an industrial vibe to these greenhouses and nurseries. You can see the footprint of the nurseries, I mean the greenhouses, but you can also see there's different kinds of outbuildings. There's the owner's house, there's a garage, there's the auto shop, there's it looks like a group outhouse, probably for workers. There's workers' dwellings behind the greenhouses. There's water tanks and windmills. There's just all kinds of built infrastructure goes into producing these flowers. I'm sorry, there's another important nursery that was established around this time, was started by Joseph Gregoire. He immigrated from Belgium to San Francisco as a child. He moved out to the Portola as a young man and built some greenhouses where he grew carnations. And I apologize for the quality of the slide, but again, I really thought, this is the Gregoire nursery. I thought this really gave you a sense of sort of how densely packed and industrial these nursery operations were. Joseph Gregoire is credited as the first grower to widely distribute carnations on the West Coast. And their nursery was also a multi-block operation, as you can see. The Gregoires are also responsible for the chain migration of another influential Belgian family, the Wynants. The Wynants also grew carnations in the neighborhood, and their greenery nursery was open also for 80 years. Here's a very sweet slide of Claire Wynant working in her family's carnation greenhouse as a child. So our greenhouses were established by the Garibaldi family. Sometimes this is called the University Mound Nursery, and University Mound is sort of an older name for this neighborhood. Sometimes it's called the Garibaldi Nursery. Sometimes it's called Garibaldi and Sons. It was actually established by fathers. The 4 of them are in this picture. We have from left to right, Giovanni, Antonio, Ernesto, and Giovanna. And their older brother, Vittorio, is not in this photograph, but he was the first to immigrate to the States. This family also came from Liguria around Genoa. They did not have any experience growing flowers in their homeland. They came here and they all followed the similar migration pattern where they lived in North Beach for a few years, saved money. They moved out to the Portola neighborhood and purchased land and established this greenhouse. They bought the site in 1921. It was 2 city blocks that had been used as a dairy, so there had been cattle use on this site. As soon as they bought the land, they started building their greenhouses. On the left, we have an actual picture of Giovanna Garibaldi building the University Mound, or the Garibaldi nurseries. On the right, I think this is actually a member of the Wynant family, but I wanted to give you a sense of what it was like to build these greenhouses. There's no architect involved in this project. Materials were purchased from local lumber suppliers. Presumably some of the more complicated parts like pulleys and louvers for the ridge ridgelines, probably purchased from a catalog, although in my research I wasn't able to find evidence of these catalogs, but presumably they were able to purchase these from catalogs. They may have used a pattern book. You know, as Eleanor said, this is there's a really typical form for rose growing greenhouses, and these match those exactly. So this is the same slide that Eleanor showed, but it's a little bit of a zoomed out view. On the far right, we have our site, and we think this photograph was actually taken in 1923. Let me minimize myself. On the right, this is the Garibaldi Brothers Nursery. There were 9 greenhouses on the right, 4 on the left. At the top of the site, there were 2 above ground water tanks, and this area is in cultivation. Down here, they have a boiler house that they built, which if you look closely, the roof has the asymmetrical span like the greenhouses, even though I don't think it needed to, but I think it's very cute. There's a windmill, there's an artisanal well, there's some open space here, there's standing water, which is probably related to the Yosemite slope. But yeah, so it's kind of a complicated site. I like this slide because it shows that, like, you know, right across the street, there's another family's nursery, and they have their home and they have their greenhouses, they have cultivated land, and then across the street, there's another one just like it. And then in the distance, there's another one. And then in the very far distance on the right, that's actually the Farr nursery that we already talked about. And then, so you can really see that this site was very, really characterized by greenhouses. Okay. All right. Oh, they also, I wanted to say, they own the next block over as well. This little house is left over from the dairy, and they used it for storage. And then they built 3 little family homes on this lot as well. And then the rest of the lot was used for growing open stock. They also put in some windbreaks here on the lot to protect from the wind. You can see there's all different kinds of flowers in cultivation here. This picture is a little bit later, we think from the 1930s. So the Garibaldis planted roses in 9 of their greenhouses, snapdragons in 2 greenhouses, and ferns in 1 greenhouse. I can't change my slides anymore. Okay. They gave up on ferns pretty quickly, even though ferns are actually traditionally associated with Italian growers pretty commonly, but the Garibaldis thought they weren't profitable, and they switched to roses. And they were pretty quickly, they were growing roses exclusively in their greenhouses. In their open stock field, they planted dahlias, delphinium, French marigolds, pansies, coreopsis, and stock. All 5 of the Garibaldis worked in their nursery. There was very little seasonal variation in output. Days started before sunrise, and morning tasks included picking the roses and watering the crops. They ate lunch that was prepared by one of their wives. And then in the afternoon, their afternoon tasks included selecting similar sized blooms and length stems and tying them into bundles for sale. Something you learn when you're doing research is that people don't take pictures of themselves working, they take pictures of their children. So here we have a very cute picture of someone in the family, a little bambino. And but I included this slide because I think, as Eleanor said, it really shows the density and the output of the crop that these people were producing. In the early summer, the greenhouses were painted white to protect the roses from the sunshine. And over the winter, the white paint would wash away. And so this is a task that needed to be repeated every year. And then every 2 years, they cut the roses down to the stems to promote regrowth. While they were working, they wore heavy denim, jackets, and pants in order to protect themselves from the thorns. And they wore big rubber boots to protect themselves from the moist environment inside the greenhouses. Between the brothers, they had 7 sons. All of these sons worked in the greenhouses during the summer and then after school. And the family also hired 2 full-time helpers, which were also Italian immigrants, and they lived on the property as well. And I know from oral history that sometimes daughters worked in greenhouses, but at this nursery, the daughters didn't work in the greenhouses. They worked with their mothers, or they took care of their siblings, and they spent a lot of time playing in the neighborhood. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, the oldest brother, Vittorio, used to drive the flowers to the wholesale market. And he often took his children and his grandchildren with him. Okay. So the Garibaldis sold their flowers at the San Francisco wholesale market. And they were members of the San Francisco Flower Growers Association, which was the Italian and Italian-American industry group. Sorry, this is one more slide of how beautifully undeveloped this neighborhood was when the family was running their nursery. San Francisco had a long established tradition of enjoying flowers. At the turn of the 20th century, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that the people of San Francisco spent $1 million a year on cut flowers, and no other city of a similar size bought flowers at a higher rate. The earliest markets were 3 times a week right in downtown San Francisco on Market Street at Kearny. And during this time, you know, the flower industry was really dominated by 3 different ethnic groups, immigrants from China, Japan, and Italy. And all these groups suffered various types of discrimination that led them to form strong ethnic associations and look for their livelihood in some form of self-employment. And members of these immigrant groups came into the city every 3 times a week to sell their flowers, and the Chronicle described them as an army of growers that were swarming into the city from the east and the south. It sort of gives you a sense of the racial temperament at the time. Each group sort of settled in a different geographic area, and they developed a separate area of flower growing expertise. The Chinese growers were most commonly settled down on the peninsula, and they grew asters, sweet peas, and pom-pom chrysanthemums. Japanese nurseries were most likely, almost exclusively, located in the East Bay, in Berkeley and Oakland and further south. And they grew larger chrysanthemums, roses, carnations, and other greenhouse crops. And Italians, as we've already talked about, mostly live in the Portola or other South San Francisco neighborhoods. And they grew roses, ferns, violets, snapdragons, and daisies. So with all these types of flowers, growers really had to orchestrate production to match demand, and they also had to find an efficient means of distributing their highly perishable product. Growers understood that controlling sales to wholesalers and retailers was really essential. So in 1909, Chinese, Japanese, and Italian growers collaborated and established the first San Francisco wholesale flower market. I think this is on Lusk Street in downtown San Francisco, south of Market. This is the first grower-operated flower market on the Pacific Coast, and it enabled growers to collaborate on establishing fair prices for their product and also offer a variety of products under one roof for consumers. This was located in a rented space. So over the time, these 3 ethnic groups established official governing organizations, and these governing organizations worked together to set policies at the market and to manage the market. And so in the 20s, you know, the industry was still very strong, and they moved into they leased a 22,000 square foot building, also south of Market. And as the industry stayed strong through World War II and after World War II, they commissioned construction of a new purpose-built wholesale flower market. So when this market opened, it was described as the biggest flower market in the country. And I mean, if you live in the Bay Area, you know this is still operating. But the managing organization sold this lot to a property developer in 2014. And this is sort of was the original planned development that was going to go on the site, and the flower market sort of kept at the ground level. But there's also conversations about what the market needs, which is being able to drop off flowers in big trucks, is not what the neighborhood wants. And so they may end up moving the flower market elsewhere outside of Soma. So back out at the University Mound Nursery, after the first generation of Garibaldi brothers died, the two of their sons took over full-time operation of the nursery. And like I said, the industry stayed strong through the 50s, and they made some changes at their site. They built another storage building on the lot, and they also installed a complicated pesticide distribution system. But as the 20th century kind of wore on, several factors came together to start to spell the end of the flower industry in the Portola neighborhood. Population increase in San Francisco after World War II was massive, and it really drove an increase in housing demand. And a lot of greenhouse owners who were sitting on large land holdings sold to housing developers. So that includes the Garibaldis. Actually, they sold their open stock field in 1958. And you can see the greenhouses, and then the open stock field on the right is now totally covered in houses. The Garibaldi family did keep their 3 family homes, and they still own at least one of these homes. In the mid-1960s, the federal government actually introduced floriculture to Colombia in South America as part of sort of an early war on drugs effort. They wanted farmers to replace their cocoa plant with floriculture, and the government kept low duty taxes on these imports, and it was hard for US growers to compete with the price of these new imported flowers from Colombia. And then in the 1970s, growers were impacted by high oil prices, which really jacked up the price of heating their greenhouses. They were also hit with increased labor costs as farm workers began to unionize in the 70s. And then in the 1980s, there was just increased awareness about the health impacts of the pesticides that were really common in this industry. So finally, just a demographic factor, these greenhouses were started by first generation immigrants between 1880 and 1920, and they often successfully handed these businesses over to their first or their second generation. But by the time the third generation was ready to take over, I mean, the success of these industries was sort of contributed to their failure in the end because, or their demise in the end, because a lot of these third generation family members, were able to go to college and have professional careers, and they were less inclined to take over a very labor intensive family business. So in 1970, there were 5 nurseries operating in this neighborhood, our University Mound Nursery, the Ferraris, the Wynets, another Italian family, the Ristanis, and the Gregorys. And by the end of the 1970s, there were only 2 left, University Mound Nursery and the Ristanis. The Ristani family's property was sold and turned into housing in the 90s. And has been, and so this means that the University Mound Nursery is the only physical evidence of this neighborhood's floricultural history. So the Garibaldi family placed this site on the market in 2013. The San Francisco Public Utilities Commission considered purchasing the site as part of a creek daylighting program. And there was some effort, a collaboration between the PUC and the greenhouse project to keep some of the greenhouses and daylight the creek and make a kind of nice neighborhood amenity here. But in the end, those negotiations didn't come together, and the site was sold to a private housing developer in 2015. And this is the initial plan that was proposed for new housing at the site. Not a lot of greenhouse here. The greenhouse project really continued to advocate for this site and just the neighborhood's floricultural history in general. They're working with other neighborhood organizations, including a group called the Friends of 770, which is the address 770 Woolsey of the greenhouses, and also the Portola Urban Greening Committee. They're working to increase the whole neighborhood's connections to its history, and they've done a lot of really good neighborhood outreach and developed this Portola Green Plan, which is full of really good implementable goals for the neighborhood. It's ranging from like a full-scale greening throughout the neighborhood to smaller things like garden district tours and beekeeping efforts. In October 2016, these groups were effective in getting the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to officially recognize the Portola as San Francisco's garden district. and endorsed the goals of the Portola Green Plan, and the neighborhood groups have had this beautiful sign painted in this sort of welcome intersection at the beginning of the neighborhood. But the endorsement from the Board of Supervisors doesn't come with any legal backbone. It's just a recognition. So in 2017, like I said, we started the landmarking effort, and that was finished in 2019. Our findings were supported by members of the city planning staff and also the consultant that the housing developer was required to hire. Everybody was in agreement that this is a really special site. But ultimately, the nomination was rejected by the Historic Preservation Commission in San Francisco, which I think just really gives you a sense of how intense the pressure is to build new housing in San Francisco. But you know, the greenhouse project has still not given up, and I really have to give it to them. You know, these greenhouses are still standing. We don't know what's going to happen. The greenhouse project is participating in negotiations with the property owner to try to find a partial preservation solution for some of the structures at this site. And I'm really hoping for a good outcome.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. We will come back for questions in a couple minutes, and I'm going to segue over to, let me see where you are. All right. Are you Nancy? You can make yourself visible, or you're not going to be visible, but you can unmute yourself. We're going to have Nancy Carroll Carter. You know, we had some technical difficulties, so things got a little behind. Okay. All right, Nancy, are you ready to share your screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
When I was alerted to the National Park Service 2020 HOWLS Challenge, the theme Vanishing or Lost Landscapes immediately made me think of the Balboa Park Fountain Grotto here in San Diego. I had never written a historic American landscape survey report, but Janet Graysick offered advice and encouragement. And it turned out that the compilation of a short form HOWLS report was the perfect project during a pandemic lockdown. I had already done some research on the Fountain Grotto and knew its historical significance as the first decorative feature built in Balboa Park. But the HOWLS report called for much more research. And in this presentation, I'm sharing what I learned. The story of the Golden Hill Fountain Grotto begins with the creation of San Diego's large urban park in 1868. Just 18 years after California became a state, and when San Diego was still a small town of just 2,300 people, the city council set aside 1,400 acres as a city park. The park was just north of the small downtown business district. It was much larger than New York Central Park, which had been established in 1853 with 775 acres. But unlike Central Park, San Diego's park had no landscape plan for its first 34 years. It was not until 1902 that New York landscape architect Samuel Parsons Jr. was to create a landscape development plan for San Diego's park. Parsons' name will be familiar to many of you. He was the head landscape architect of New York City for many years. He designed parks and cemeteries across the country. And in 1899, Parsons was a founding member of the American Society of Landscape Architects. As this early photograph of park road building shows, the terrain of City Park was not inviting. In fact, San Diego's park was a desolate and arid expanse of coastal chaparral with rough mesas and deep canyons. At San Diego's first celebration of Arbor Day in 1904, school children gathered for a mass tree planting in a barren park canyon. Under the Parsons Plan, slow and incremental development was underway throughout San Diego's large park. But there was one small area that was getting much more attention, thanks to well-organized community activists. The prosperous neighborhood of Golden Hill bordered the park. Its Community Improvement Committee raised money and gained permission to privately fund landscaping in their corner of City Park. Here's a modern aerial view of the park. The arrow shows the location of the Golden Hill Improvement Zone at the southeast corner of City Park. The neighborhood called this area Golden Hill Park, and that name is carried on to the present day. It's a park within the larger park. Golden Hill Park was so attractive in the early days that entrepreneurial photographers created postcards showing its landscape beauty. The Golden Hill Park area had more greenery, more trees, and more defined walking paths than most other areas of the park. Notice the large homes under the arrow on the right-hand postcard. Many of San Diego's wealthiest citizens lived in the beautiful Victorian houses of Golden Hill. In 1907, the Golden Hill Neighborhood Improvement Group decided to top off their park enhancements by building a fountain within Golden Hill Park. They got the required city approvals and hired an architect. The improvement group built the Golden Hill Fountain Grotto and arranged for extra landscaping of the area. Unfortunately, there are almost no really good photographs of the grotto from the early days, but the completed structure looked like this on a tinted postcard. Twin stone stairways came down on each side into the grotto. Running water spilled down into this basin in the main fountain. There were benches that curved along the walls at each side of the fountain. And because the grotto was tucked into the head of a canyon and on a level below the park walkways and roads, it very much felt like the cozy retreat it was intended to be. Although again, this photograph is of poor quality, it helps to illustrate the elaborate landscaping that was part of the neighborhood project. The abundant surround of trees and shrubs contributed a sense of protection and privacy for those visiting the hidden grotto. 3 prominent San Diegans are closely associated with the Fountain Grotto. One is credited with the original concept, the second is the designer, a well-known architect, and third was the newly named San Diego Superintendent of Parks, who oversaw the construction and landscaping of the installation. And here's some more information about each of them. Leroy Augustus Wright was a lawyer, banker, politician, and all-around good citizen of San Diego. In retirement, he devoted himself to capturing San Diego's history. But most important for the Fountain Grotto project, Wright was both a leader of the Golden Hill Community Improvement Group and a member of the City Park Commission. He was the liaison who gained approval for the private community group to build their fountain within the publicly owned city park. The architect of the Fountain Grotto was Henry Lord Gay. Born into a prominent East Coast family, he was privately educated and as a young man was able to spend 3 years traveling and studying in Europe. He mainly pursued architectural studies in Italy. Henry Gay entered an architectural practice in Chicago and became regionally well known. He designed all kinds of structures, but gained fame for his summer homes in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Stone Manor, shown on the lower left, is now on the National Register of Historic Places. The house on the right was built for Harry and Rose Selfridge, before Mr. Selfridge decamped to London to establish his famous department store. The Institute of Art in Chicago holds some of Henry Lord Gay's architectural drawings. Gay moved to San Diego in 1906 to be near his older sister, who had come to Southern California for her health. His architectural practice flourished in San Diego, and he did every kind of design work, including private homes, churches, hotels, schools, and commercial buildings. Henry Gay is best remembered in San Diego today for his Western Metal Supply Company building. There may not appear to be anything remarkable about this commercial structure, but when San Diego built its downtown ballpark in 2004, a decision was made to preserve and adaptively reuse this building. Henry Gay's Western Metal Supply Company is now an integral part of San Diego's baseball park. Here it is, right here. The practical work of finding the perfect site and getting the fountain grotto built and landscaped fell to George Cook. Cook was one of the many English-born and trained landscape gardeners who immigrated to the United States in the 19th century. His first work in this country was on the New Jersey estate of a Vanderbilt heir. He then joined the New York City Public Parks Department, where he met Samuel Parsons Jr., who was impressed by Cook's talents and experience. They formed a partnership for private landscape commissions. It was as the partner of Samuel Parsons Jr. that George Cook first arrived in San Diego in 1903. He was carrying a copy of the map shown on the right. This map was Parsons' plan for the San Diego City Park system of entrances, roads, and trails. Cook was charged with implementing the plan, and he returned to San Diego from New York once or twice a year for the next 4 years, overseeing road building, planting, and other improvements to San Diego's park. When Cook traveled from snowy New York back to San Diego in January 1907, he announced that he had come to stay. He was promptly named San Diego's first superintendent of parks. The Fountain Grotto was completed under Cook's supervision in 1908. Except for the park roads that Cook had been constructing since 1903, it was the first permanent built feature in the park, and it was the first decorative installation. Leroy Wright's original concept of a cozy place with running water undoubtedly appealed to locals because San Diego was such an arid place. Although there were springs and streams in the mountains of East San Diego County, bringing a reliable water supply to the coastal areas was an ongoing challenge. The visitors pictured here are tourists. The Fountain Grotto was a San Diego attraction, although it faded in popularity after 1915 when the Panama, California Exposition brought extensive development and attractions to the heart of City Park, by then renamed Balboa Park. Sometime in the 1930s, water stopped flowing in the Fountain Grotto. The Great Depression meant that resources for park maintenance were very limited. San Diego then underwent huge changes during and after World War II. The demographics of the Golden Hill neighborhood shifted to a more transient population, and the organized neighborhood attention to Golden Hill Park faded away. The Fountain Grotto was neglected and vandalized over the next several decades. San Diego's preservation group, Save Our Heritage organization, raised the alarm in 2009 by placing the Fountain Grotto on its endangered list. This focused sufficient attention to provoke a cleanup of the site, the removal of trash and graffiti, and basic repairs to stabilize the stonework and make the stairway safe. Save Our Heritage declared the site saved in 2012. The fountain basin had been repaired and some crude benches added to recreate the inglenook seating. This wide-angle photograph helps to illustrate the way in which the grotto is neatly tucked into the very top of a canyon. As part of the rescue, an Eagle Scout took up the cause and organized new plantings around the upper level of the grotto, just along the curved top rim of the canyon. Unfortunately, even this modest effort to add some decorative landscaping has not been kept up due to understaffing in Balboa Park. In fact, today the grotto can be hard to find, even though a park road runs very close to it. It helps if you know to look for the cairns that mark the stairways down the canyon side. The stairway on each side of the grotto has these marker stones. Here's the way down into the grotto, and this is looking back up that same stairway. A low stone wall connects the two stairways and symbolically encloses the grotto. On the other side of this wall, the canyon drops off steeply and is quite wild and rugged. The juxtaposition of the cozy grotto with untamed nature in the canyon was quite deliberate. Today, deep shade is provided by a coastal live oak that has grown up just outside the grotto's low wall. In the restoration done in the year 2012, the rustic stone basin was repaired, but there was no plan to restore running water to the fountain. And it is certainly unlikely that the Golden Hill Fountain Grotto will ever again look as it did in its early postcard. But the most basic question is its survival. Unfortunately, there is not a long-term plan of preservation and maintenance to protect this first Balboa Park design feature. However, more San Diegans are learning about the quaint fountain grotto, and a nonprofit park advocacy group, Friends of Balboa Park, is working with current Golden Hill neighborhood groups to develop a plan to improve and activate this area of Balboa Park. There is also discussion of erecting interpretive signage in the area to help people learn about this quirky 112-year-old structure. For now, we can but appreciate its historical significance and enjoy the Fountain Grotto as a vestige of arts and crafts design sensibilities, including its careful sighting into the contours of a natural canyon, its rustic stonework using vernacular materials. Those rounded cobblestones in the stairways are found all over San Diego, and the dark reddish stone of the walls is also local. And of course, the enclosed space and benches flanking the central fountain evoke the homey inglenooks favored in arts and crafts homes. I hope you can visit the Fountain Grotto when you are next in Balboa Park. Thank you for joining in tonight. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Very nice, thank you. I'm going to ask all the presenters to bring themselves in.
You have to do it, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to get there.
Okay.
Everybody's in a different place in the queue. And in fact, okay. And so we've got a few questions that have come in, and Eleanor, you are unmuted.
I think I can address a couple of the questions.
Okay, okay. And you see them there, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Janet asked if anybody had identified the extant roses at the greenhouses. Probably those roses that were in the slides that I presented last, kind of peeking up through the degraded structures. And as far as I know, and Stacy should confirm, but we haven't seen any plant lists for the property. She did not uncover that during her research. But I think there's probably some additional avenues, maybe through the flower mart, or if people wanted to do some archaeology, some like botanist archaeology. I think that there's enough physical evidence that this could be discerned.
Great. And we understand that the flowers went to San Francisco. Are you aware if they went to other locations?
I think we are. I think we're the Flower Mart distributed across the country.
Okay. There was a question, it's a technical question that you may or may not know the answer to, because, and I thought about this with, particularly roses, which are so prone to disease, and they're so densely planted, they must have had a sophisticated system for air circulation. Is it just opening the windows?
No, there were very sophisticated ventilation systems built into the houses. Neither Stacy or I really had time to go into that tonight, but there were also really sophisticated irrigation and steam systems utilized at these types of commercial ranges. So as far as I'm aware, the ventilation for rose houses was not, it may have been tailored to the rose plant, but those types of ventilation systems were present in all of the commercial houses I've seen. And I saw that question come in, and I went and I looked at some of the documentation that I have, and I found pictures of carnation houses and other types of flower growing houses that had very similar ventilation and the same kind of density in plant as well.
Interesting. One of our viewers says that a few years ago, the Garibaldis were still selling flowers. You aware of any Garibaldis still in the business today?
I'm not. It's not out of the question that they are members of this Garibaldi family, but Garibaldi is the most common name from Liguria. So they're definitely,
okay.
in the course of doing my research, I came across a few other Garibaldis who I thought, here we have the key. I can interview these people, but they're not, I have no relation to these Garibaldis. So
Okay.
it's not out of the question. I'm not familiar with that particular site, but there are a lot of Garibaldis and a lot of them grow flowers. So
That's great. We have some questions about the grotto as well. Were there actually formal drawings made for the grotto?
Not that I've ever seen, although there was a design drawn by the architect, but I don't think they're extant. An interesting story about that is, after the grotto was designed, the architect was in a downtown shell shop, if we remember there used to be shell shops, and saw a 400-pound clamshell, giant clamshell, and decided it had to be part of the fountain. So he wanted to redesign everything around this clamshell, but the neighborhood group said, no, we're very happy with the original design.
That's a good story. Do you know anything about what is the stone? Was that local stone, and do you know what it is? And do you happen to know anything?
Are we talking about that reddish stone?
Mm-hmm.
I have been trying to identify that stone, and I think it is from what's called the Linda Vista layer, because I know the Linda Vista layer does produce a reddish stone, but I have been trying to research that because this stone has been used in other landscapes in San Diego. It was very popular, and I haven't been able to track it down. And it's funny that you would ask, because I was thinking I've got to get in touch with a geologist who can tell me what this is, but I haven't been able to find it just through internet research.
Okay, so anybody in the area who might be able to give her a hand.
Any geologists out there?
That's right. And do you happen to know anything about the builders of it or the stonemasons?
No, I really don't. And again, I have never read anything about it, but I suspect it was people on the park staff. And George Cook was quite well known as an engineer as well as a landscape architect. And so I think he just supervised people from the park staff. It would be my best guess. Although again, in all my research, I've never seen a description of who literally did the work.
Always so many mysteries remain.
Yeah.
So you can see that we've had a couple more questions come in about the greenhouses. I know we're running over a little bit, and if you can hang on for a little longer and have some more discussion with us, that would be great. And if you need to go, want to say thank you very much for joining us, but we're going to carry on a little longer here. All right, so do you see, Stacy and Eleanor, do you see those questions about the greenhouses? All right, the siting, they wanted, you know, what directions they were sited in, and the development pressures and the poor state of the buildings, and the name, University Mound. How did it get that name?
I'll start. So the greenhouses were sited in the east-west direction, with the long span facing south, and that's typical of rose growing ranges. The aerial photograph that Stacy showed indicated that many of the greenhouse ranges in the Portola neighborhood were sited that way. So it would be interesting to know, you know, and I think she does know this, or she has this data, maybe not handy, but I think probably many of them were rose growing ranges. And it would be interesting to compare that to some of the non-rose growing ranges down the peninsula or in the East Bay. And then I'll start the naming discussion by saying I'm pretty sure that this part of the city, when it was first being platted, was planned for a college. And so they named a lot of the streets after local or international universities and colleges. But I'm not sure if the college was ever actually built.
Good. And Stacy, you need to do that. I will ask you to unmute. Got it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gray. Yeah, this neighborhood was originally platted in the 1860s for a university, and there was a small university out here at the beginning of this neighborhood's history. But yeah, it was that university moved downtown. I forget what it was called, but it moved downtown pretty quickly, but the neighborhood retained the name.
Okay, well, good.
Do you want to speak about the development pressure, Stacy? I feel like you have more information on that.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, what would we consider a reasonable preservation success?
Well, I used to have an idea about what a reasonable solution was. And as the time goes on, my expectations are winnowing away. But, you know, I mean, I would love to see, you know, I consider, you know, my purest preservation heart, part of what makes this site significant is that it takes up a whole city block. You know, it really shows you the scope, as I sort of tried to emphasize in my talk, that these were not cute little flower growing houses. These were semi-industrial sites of production, you know, and I think the fact that it spanned the whole block and it had multiple components, I think that's important to telling the story, you know, and at one point, this neighborhood, I think almost 40 blocks in this neighborhood were covered with this type of greenhouse. So, you know, my pure preservationist says a reasonable solution is retaining the entire footprint. And a real compromise, I think, would be retaining a couple of these greenhouses, you know, and putting them back in production, either for, you know, income producing production or just neighborhood use and education center. There's all different kinds of ideas have been tossed around, and not just tossed around. There's been a lot of like really serious consideration of, you know, how much of this site do we need to keep in order to have it sort of be able to produce income as a floricultural business. So, you know, if we can't have that much, how much do we need to keep for it to still sort of tell the story of what these greenhouses look like and what they kind of used to do for the neighborhood. So
yeah, they're complicated.
Yeah, regarding the poor state, my argument is that these buildings were meant to be consistently replaced piece by piece through their entire life. And so, you know, it would be very easy to continue to replace those damaged parts, you know, and I don't think it would be that hard to bring these up to their pretty working condition again pretty easily. I mean, we showed a lot of really damaged portions, but there are a few of these greenhouses that are still in pretty good condition and could probably pretty easily get back into production.
Well, we will cross our fingers that we see improvements in both sites. We have San Diego and San Francisco. That would be beneficial. And I like to think that, you know, a little consciousness got raised with a few folks anyway today. Just before I sign off here, I'm going to see if there's any last minute questions. Keith is posting something about greenhouse industry in Richmond with a documentary. And Keith, perhaps you can put that on our Facebook page, the CGLHS Facebook page, which is available to everyone. That would be a good way to share that, because we're going to end the talk pretty soon. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. It was really interesting, and I'm so glad you were able to join us and do this. And thank you all. We'll see you in the new year. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Janet.
Bye.
Mhm.